The Center for Educational Media and the College of Education at Middle Tennessee State University are proud to offer professional development to K-12 educators in Tennessee through our online video library. The following video is presented by the Center for Educational Media in partnership with Professional Educators of Tennessee's Leader U Conference. For more professional development videos, check out our website at cem.mtsu.edu.
Hi everyone, my name is Whitney Loring and I am a clinical psychologist at the Vanderbilt Kennedy Center's Treatment and Research Institute for Autism Spectrum Disorders, or TRIAD. And I'm here to talk with you today about how to support students with autism spectrum disorder in whatever educational setting you might be working with students with autism. A large portion of my role here at TRIAD is to work with schools across the state through a contract we have with the Department of Education. And what I do when we go into schools is we do a lot of different professional development and training and consultation, and it's all focused on this, on how to support students with autism and help set the stage for them to have the most success possible. So what I'm going to try to do today is kind of condense all of that into some of the main things that we tend to focus on when we're out in schools and the things we kind of look for as places to start in helping to set situations up for success for your students with autism. So before we get into those strategies, we need to think about why does it even matter? Why is this a topic that was chosen that we're here talking about today? And the reason is that we see autism a lot and we're seeing it more and more as the years go by. So right now, the national prevalence for autism through the CDC's numbers say 1 in 68 children have an autism spectrum disorder. And so those numbers have increased over time as they recalculate the prevalence every several years. And that's the national average that we're seeing. But when we look within schools in Tennessee, we're seeing some similar trends. So I think this is some interesting data to look at to kind of understand how big of a deal this is right now. So when you're looking at students 3 through 21 who were receiving special education services in Tennessee from 2005-2006 school year to the 2014-2015 school year, we saw that there's actually been a 2.56% decrease in the total amount of students that are receiving special education services in Tennessee. But then when you break it down and you look at the classifications under which they're being served, we see that intellectual disability had a slight increase, like 1.3%. Developmental disability had a 43.57%, and then learning disability actually had a decrease by about 12 or 13%. But despite the overall decrease in special education services in Tennessee, there was a 191% increase in the number of students that were being served under the autism classification in Tennessee schools over the course of time that I just mentioned. So it's a very big deal in Tennessee. If you haven't seen this already in your classroom of more students that have been diagnosed with autism or have that educational classification, you probably will. So we know that with this heightened increase in numbers that we need to make sure we're setting up the educational environment in a way that's going to help all of these students reach their full potential and be able to use the strengths that they do have to be successful in their educational setting. So now that we know why it's important, we need to understand what autism is before we can talk about what to do to help support these students. So if a student has an autism spectrum disorder diagnosis, that means that there's a certain quality and type and number of behaviors that student shows in these two main areas: the deficits in social communication and the presence of restricted or repetitive patterns of behavior. Those are the two categories. That's whether a child is 2 or an adult is 72. If they have an autism diagnosis, the basis is in those two areas. You may see other associated features and challenges that they're having as a result of that, like academic, learning, and social skills, but they're really based in these two areas. And as you've seen, for any of you that have students with autism in your class, every student with autism is different, just like every student is different. But we do know that across that range, there are some similarities that make autism what it is, that are based in these two areas. And it's really important to understand those so that we can know how to support those specific areas in what we do in our classroom. So this first piece that's sort of the hallmark of autism, that's at the core and the base of so much of what we see in individuals with autism, and that's the characteristic that sort of sets it apart from other diagnoses or other disability categories that you may see in your class, is this challenge with reading and understanding and using the thousands of unspoken and assumed and abstract rules that we follow every day that guide our behavior, that nobody necessarily sat down and taught us, but we just pick up on by being around people and by kind of learning from those situations. This is something that's really, really hard for a lot of individuals with autism. Either they don't even recognize that there's a piece that they're missing, or they recognize that it's there, but they're not quite sure what to do with it because they have a hard time reading those things. And this shows itself throughout the day in a classroom setting. There are so many unspoken rules, so many assumed things that we expect our students to do. And it starts with little things and goes into big things, but it really impacts all of our interactions throughout the day. So thinking first as simple as something as personal space. So this might be something that you do think is concrete and maybe is taught. Maybe you've taught personal space in a more concrete way, like staying outside of people's bubbles or something like that. But thinking about just something as simple as that, it can be very, very complex. So think about if you get on an elevator and there are lots of people on the elevator and you go ahead and get on, what do? Yep, you find the corner, you try to make yourself as small as possible, you kind of squish down. You're not going to probably start talking to someone else. You're probably not going to be playing on your phone. You're not going to be looking at what they're doing on their phone. You're not going to smell their hair beside you if their shampoo smells great. You're just going to make yourself as small as you can in the smallest little spot that you can find. That's appropriate personal space in that situation, even though you're really, really close to someone. Now, if you get in that same elevator later in the day and there's one or two people in it, what do you do at that point? Yeah, so you might start a conversation. You might get in and go to the other side, say, hi, how are you? Nod or smile. You may continue a conversation you were having with someone when you got on. You may look at your phone. Would you snuggle right back up to them like you did earlier when it was packed? No, you wouldn't. But that's personal space in that situation. But it's the same building, it's the same elevator, it's maybe even the same people, it's the same day. And just that one variable of the number of people in the elevator completely changed that rule of what was appropriate personal space or not. And I'm certain that nobody sat down and told you those rules at some point in your life about elevator behavior. You just picked up on it. And that's just kind of a silly example to highlight how much that impacts our day, because the big piece with some of these unspoken rules is that they change. Once you learn them, they change based on the situation and the person and the expectations that time of the day. So being able to understand when they apply and when they change is a really difficult thing for a lot of individuals with autism. Like this little boy right here. He's been outside on the playground, running around, yelling with his friends. Now they go into the library and suddenly he's supposed to be quiet and walk. Again, same day, same school, same friends, but I'm inside the wall instead of outside the wall, and the rules completely change. And this is really important to keep in mind, because so often in a school setting, we're in the same physical space with the same people, but the rules change all day long. And we expect our students to pick up on that because they've been in your class all year, or because they've been in school before, or because the other students are doing those things. But if that's an assumption that hasn't been spoken in a clear way, they may not be picking up on what is the piece that I'm supposed to read to know that this rule still applies or not. I was able to play on the computer and it's still sitting right there. I'm still in the same room, but now all of a sudden when I try to play on it, I get in trouble. How do I know when it's available again or not? There's no real clear way unless we try to make those things more concrete. So we're going to talk a lot about some ways to do that, because this really is at the base of a lot of what we see in our classroom that we may sometimes misinterpret as not following directions on purpose or not being able to participate, when really it's a challenge with understanding these pieces. And then one other example of how this plays out throughout the day has to do with reading body language. Besides being able to use those nonverbal cues to communicate, being able to read those to guide our behavior and our interactions. So right now you're being a good audience, you're listening, you're smiling, so I feel like I'm okay. But if I said something and you rolled your eyes and just crossed your arms and let out a big sigh, or you closed your materials and walked out. I would think I said something that was offensive. I didn't mean to. What did I say? I'd be trying to backtrack and think about how to reword it, when you probably weren't even trying to communicate with me. You were just having a reaction. But that reaction completely would change my behavior. Same thing if I'm telling a story or giving an example, and you shoot a look to someone who you know, and you know what situation you're both thinking about when you shoot that look. You don't have to say anything, but you read those things. And this is something that's really hard in that same realm of those unspoken rules for individuals with autism to read and know what to do with. So they might not pick up on the fact that everyone else is cleaning up their stuff and pushing in the chairs, so we're almost done with this activity, so I should start cleaning up and wrapping up. So instead I get really upset when it's time to transition because it felt more abrupt to me. Or I'm not reading that when I talk about certain things in the classroom, my teacher gets an embarrassed look, even though it's something that's okay to talk about at home or to talk about with my friends at lunch. Or when I go on and on and on about a topic I'm really interested in and they're looking at their watch and kind of looking around, that maybe that means they're tired of hearing it right then. They may not be picking up on those cues. So again, it's going to be really important to think about some ways where we can make those expectations clearer through some other means that are more concrete and easier to understand. So that's kind of the social piece of the social communication. The other big piece to keep in mind with that first circle is kind of the communication piece of that. So we know that students with autism can range from being minimally verbal to verbally fluent and everywhere in between, intellectual disabilities to gifted intelligence and everywhere in between. So that's not a part of the diagnosis. But what is a part is, regardless of that skill level, individuals with autism typically have a hard time using whatever verbal and nonverbal communication they have consistently and flexibly across different situations, especially if that situation is new or overwhelming or challenging. Not because they don't want to, but because it's something that's much harder for them. So a few examples again to kind of think about how this might show itself in an educational setting. You may have students who are able to use words or signs or whatever communication they do have in certain situations, but not when they're really overwhelmed. I worked with a middle schooler with autism who was struggling with some pretty significantly aggressive behaviors towards staff and students, some escape behaviors when she was overwhelmed, trying to jump off of a moving bus during a field trip, trying to leave the school, leave the classroom, that seemed to others like it was coming out of nowhere. But she was able to communicate outside of those situations why it was happening and what she needed to say to somebody. But she said, in those moments, I can't find the words. And I kind of equate that to if you're ever in an argument with somebody and you just draw a blank, and then afterwards you're like, oh, I should have said this. Oh, this would have been so great. That's minimizing it because it's a much greater degree, but that same kind of idea. You have the words, but in that moment, you can't access it because of some of the other pieces that are a part of that situation. Another piece of that is maybe being able to use whatever communication they have about certain topics, but having a harder time when it's more open or abstract. So maybe they can tell you all day long about every in and out of the whole Pokemon families that I will never understand, no matter how many times a child explains them to me. But when you ask, tell me about your day, or where does it hurt, or emotions, they're not able to use that same amount of words. And again, just one more kind of thing to equate it to, because I think it's important to have that perspective. When you drive to work, I know I go on autopilot, and I know I just drive. I don't even think about where I'm going. And I do a lot of things during it that maybe I shouldn't do, but I'll maybe call somebody. At a stoplight, I might put on lipstick, I might get some gum. But when it's winter and there's ice on the road, you better believe I'm 10 and 2, white-knuckled. I'm not putting on lipstick. I'm not chewing gum. I'm not calling my friend. Did I suddenly lose the ability to do those things? No. Do I just not want to do those things anymore now and I'm just trying to be difficult? No. I need all of my attention now because of this additional stressor. And that's what this is important to keep in mind as that next piece for students with autism. They seem like the same situation to us. I know they can ask for help. They asked for it over here when they really wanted to play that game. I know they can tell me the answer to this because I've seen them count the same kind of things over here with their toys. The situation may be very, very different as far as the environment, and you may need to think about how to make it more similar to those times that you did see it to help them succeed, but recognize that piece. And then the difference in expressive and receptive, we see this a lot with autism. You see it with a lot of other students too, but a lot with autism, either direction. So the verbal examples I just gave, just because a student can talk all day about an interest doesn't mean they can understand that same level of detail that you might be putting out there. And on the flip side, just because a student can't speak does not mean that they can't understand things that you're saying to them or about them or around them. And so in order to help them be successful and out of respect, it's very important to remember that piece and that it may not be apples to apples as far as expressive and receptive. For an individual who doesn't have verbal speech and is having to be tantrum behavior to get something, could it be for similar reasons as other students or different? And I think at the base, it can be similar in the sense that behavior is communication, and behavior serves a purpose and serves a function, no matter what kind it is, no matter who we are. So in that regard, yes, I think the reason we often see it more with autism are setting the stages as to why they need to resort to that. So if I don't have another way to communicate that I need help, or I'm overwhelmed, or I don't understand, if I've learned that throwing my pen down helps my teacher come over and know that I need help, or pushing my friend allows me to be removed from the situation that's overwhelmed, that's how I've learned to communicate, because I don't have another way to communicate that. And if it's ever worked in a situation, I've maybe learned, okay, that must be a way to communicate. If, as a person with autism, I don't understand that socially that's not the appropriate way to ask that, and none of my other friends are doing it that way, it's going to be more likely to see it more often and more frequently versus another child who may kind of, quote, grow out of those things when they realize those other pieces and they have other ways to get that need met. And there may be more reasons that this situation is that much more distressing. So another student may just want to get out of the assembly because I just don't really like it. It's kind of boring. For an individual with autism, they may be trying to get out of the assembly because the sound and the light is so overwhelming that it's painful to them. So their response is that much more severe, because it would be like if you were in a car accident and you were in pain, your response is going to be more severe than, I need help, please, because of the setting event that started it. So that's why we may see it more severely and more frequently, but at the base, it serves as communication to try to get needs met in the same way that another student might. Does that make sense? Right, and perhaps there's something about that day that's different to him that you didn't realize was different. Right. And I wish we had a lot of workshops we do that are multi-day. I wish we had the time to go into all of that, because there are so many pieces of how to kind of think about that. Hopefully what we talk about today will give you some things to start with. As a little plug, we do have workshops that I'll mention at the end that are available to educators across the state free of charge through a DOE contract. So I'll mention a few at the end in case there are things like that where you want even more detailed information. So the last piece of this that might be how you see it is this literal use of language. We don't speak literally very often. We use a lot of sarcasm and figures of speech. And I don't know how many of you remember Amelia Bedelia, but that was kind of her thing, and it was supposed to be funny. And we've maybe had experiences with students where it was funny, but it's not funny if it's really impacting your day and you're not understanding certain situations. If we say, I gotta run to the office for something, I'm gonna be back in 2 minutes, don't move. Okay, I'm not actually running. I probably am not gonna just be 2 minutes, and I didn't mean do not move. But if I'm hearing that, and I'm an individual with autism, when 2 minutes is up, I'm gonna be like, what is going on? And maybe I'm getting frustrated with my friends that are moving. And that's just a very small example, but there are little things like that that can impact understanding the situation. And then there's that second circle, the restricted interest and repetitive behaviors. So just like everything else I've talked about so far, it's gonna look different with each student. But if an individual has an autism diagnosis, there's some combination of these that are present. And what they can look like are difficulty with transitions, maybe even just ones that they know and they're fine with, but the act of closing down and starting something else is harder. Which, if you think about what we've talked about, if I'm not picking up on the fact that everybody else is kind of pushing up their chairs or cleaning up, when the teacher said 5 more minutes from across the room, she was also talking to me, it could feel very abrupt. And if I'm really intensely focused on something, being able to shut that down and move could be really hard. And then difficulties with change. There's that rigidity oftentimes, that rule-governed behavior that can be a really great strength when we identify places to use that in the student's favor, but can be really hard with things like fire drills and field trips and assemblies and substitute teachers, where that change is really anxiety-provoking and overwhelming. It may result in differences in behavior that day. Then the rigidity can also get to the level of things like certain kind of ritualistic things, having to do things in a certain order, having to use certain kinds of materials for certain activities. Repetitive movements, so that's maybe where you see more of the pacing or rocking or hand flapping, use of objects, the lining up or doing the same thing over and over with a toy, or verbal, making noises that aren't for communication purposes, or scripting or repeating things they've heard someone else say. And then intense focus, maybe a topic or an interest that's developmentally appropriate, like Thomas for a preschooler, but the intensity is not. Having to always hold Thomas, having to have only Thomas things. Or they may be topics that aren't really necessarily appropriate at any given age, like speed bumps or toilets or something like that. That again can be used in really wonderful ways, but can make it hard in a classroom setting when I've got to shift and focus on something else right now, or when I have to identify topics that are appropriate conversationally with my friends. And then the atypical sensory responses. This is one that I think is one of the most misunderstood things about autism, because I think people tend to make these all or nothing statements with this piece. All children with autism like deep pressure, or all children with autism don't like loud noise. Well, again, as I've already said several times, everyone's different, every child with autism is different, but we do know that they often experience the sensory environment in a different way than their peers. So certain things may be heightened and certain things may be under. Maybe they are less sensitive to something like pain, but they're really sensitive to a certain type of light or a certain sound or a certain texture. I worked with an individual with autism who said the buzzing of the fluorescent lights in classrooms was almost deafening to him because of that frequency that sound happened to have. So that can obviously very much impact things if we're not aware of what those things may be in that situation. Now, I went through those pretty quickly, but I wanted to spend some time on them because everything else we're going to talk about is how do I use that information to set up situations for success for my students with autism. So before we shift to that, I want to show you a clip of a wonderful colleague of mine that is an adult with autism who is wonderfully insightful, and I just enjoy interacting with to hear her experiences. And she's spending some time talking about her experience looking back. It's kind of lengthy, but I think it's really great, like I mentioned with some of the other things, to be able to hear from someone who's able to look back and speak to those things, because a lot of our students aren't able to articulate some of these same experiences they may be having. So let's just spend a couple of minutes listening to her, and then we'll...
School was difficult. So I'm an only child, and I was born in 1960. So I entered elementary school literally in the mid-60s. And so autism was not yet in the common lexicon of diagnoses. And so things were great for me as being an only child and just spending time with my mom. This was, the 60s. Moms stayed at home, dads went to work. And things were fine until I went to school, and then it was a real problem. And for me, it was partially socialization, it was partially structural. It was so many new sounds and smells. You know how those great cafeteria smells in school, and how, little things like that would be just sort of like an unpleasantness to someone, or a mild annoyance to someone, could be like debilitating to someone with autism. So my teachers, I learned to read when I was very, very young, before the age of 3. And so I was immediately bored in school. And so my teachers put me at the age of 5 in a 3rd grade class. And so, of course, socially that was even worse than anything else that could have been done at that time. And so, and part of my diagnosis journey, I guess, was I did not come to this diagnosis until I was an adult. And after my parents had died, and I was cleaning out my mom's house, and I found this box full of just notes it was like all from that era, from the 60s and 70s when I was in school. And the notes were things that she had taken talking to teachers and on the phone, and I realized how difficult that whole process was for her, and how much she didn't know, and how much she was trying to find out, and what kind of help she could get from me. And it was actually sort of through a lot of those notes that we were able to confirm this diagnosis for me as an adult, because there really are no established diagnostic criteria for adults as I understand it. So we were able to arrive at a diagnosis largely through these sort of, archaeological finds, in a sense. But part of, a number of my teachers thought I was a genius, and others thought I was, the R word, because in the 60s, there was no spectrum. There was, you were either retarded or you weren't, and that was basically, you fit into one of those two categories. And with, keeping something so rigid like that and that kind of a rubric, there was no place for someone like me. So I think they kind of, tried to fit me into this box of normality in school. And so that was a very difficult thing for me to do, because I was either bored or I was completely socially overwhelmed in one case or the other. So, and I remember going to recess and watching kids play and not understanding any of it. And it was like I had two curricula. I had the regular academic curriculum that everyone else had, and then I had a whole social curriculum that I knew nothing about and was trying to learn. And so I'd watch kids play on the playground and go, wow, Johnny said that to Susie and it made her Johnny said that to Susie and it made her laugh. And then, he said the same thing to Janie and it made her cry. And I could never understand the difference and what happened. And so felt like I was constantly a student of sort of socialization and social issues. So that's pretty exhausting. And so I think by the time you come home and you've been dealing with, all of this overload, all this information all day long, it makes parenting very difficult. It makes growing up difficult. And so I think kids on the spectrum have a really tough time in school. And it's tough being an adult, too. And some of the same issues, I think, that were difficult then are still difficult now. So, for instance, one of the things that's difficult to do is to make eye contact with people. And so I have to remind myself sort of cognitively, make eye contact. It's very unpleasant. It is literally painful to make eye contact with someone. It's weird. I don't understand it. I can make eye contact with a dog. It doesn't bother me, but with another person, it does. And it's literally very painful. And so I think people don't understand that, first of all. And I think some people see that or see the lack of eye contact as either a lack of respect or, especially with a child, an act of defiance. And really what it is, it's something that's painful. And so I can't imagine that someone would, expect a child to do something, to put their hand on a hot stove being painful, and expecting that to happen, yet they expect someone to make eye contact. And so that's sort of another sort of misconception about that we don't really understand or don't really realize what some of the symptoms are. That's another thing where we don't really understand sort of the differences of someone who has autism with someone who does not.
I know that was lengthy, but I think it's so important to hear the perspective of the students we are serving. And there were obviously things with that fortunately are different in our current educational system than back when she was in school. But there were several things that I think are so important to kind of cap what I was just talking about. She mentioned the second curriculum that she had to learn socially. And there is a researcher, Brenda Smith-Miles, who has information books and things called the hidden curriculum. And it's kind of the idea like I gave about the elevator example. This other curriculum that we learn to live in life aside from the academic curriculum. And like she said, that's exhausting if you're learning both at the same time. And I think her example of that was really great. So yeah, that kind of perspective, things like she mentioned about the eye contact, like I was saying about some of those sensory experiences, I think are just really helpful to keep in mind as we move forward to how to best support. Because not every individual's autism is going to have her same experience, but they're going to have combinations of challenges that set the stage. Now, I don't want that to be doom and gloom because she's very successful now. She's learned and been able to adapt to those things. And we know a lot as educators about how to help support students with autism, how to help bring out their strengths and their full potential based on some of these core pieces that might make it harder. And that's what we're going to spend the rest of our time thinking about. So the first take home I want you to take from all of what we talked about so far, I wasn't trying to train you to diagnose autism or anything like that. I want you to have that base to keep in mind that if a student you're working with has an autism spectrum disorder diagnosis or a suspected one or features of something similar, and they respond in a way that's different than you expect, I want you to stop and think about how the types of things I just talked about could be contributing to that situation, rather than jumping to the conclusion that they're unable to learn, or they're not able to participate in these activities, or they're purposely trying to be difficult, which are typically the inaccurate conclusions. I mean, children with autism are children, so sometimes they're trying to be difficult just like any child, but more times than not, the things that you're seeing are gonna be based in these components I just talked about and show themselves in a lot of ways that we may misinterpret if we don't think about the anchor. We don't think about why those are there. This is gonna be a much more respectful approach to the student and a much more productive approach because we're getting at the root of why we're seeing that. So that's the first thing I want you to think about as we move forward. And with that, we know that there are those challenges, but then we want to, just like any of our students, play to their strengths. Every student's different. We want to know what their individual strengths are. But in the broad sense, students with autism, regardless of their skill level, are going to typically respond best to input that is visual instead of just verbal, to input that is concrete or that we can make as concrete as possible with abstract content, structure and consistency, which everyone loves, but individuals with autism really need in order to understand their environment. The repetition that, again, a lot of students love, but really individuals with autism respond very well to same words being used in certain situations, same materials, as much repetition of certain things to understand this is the rule, this is the deal. And that rule-governed behavior can be a really great strength for students with autism versus another student who may be pressing those rules a little bit more or may see more variability in shades of gray. This can be a really great strength in certain skill areas that they can use to their advantage and potential. And then clearly defined opportunities for reinforcement that I'm gonna mention a little bit later. Because there are often really intense interests and really intense responses to things, those can be very, very motivating for a student, even more so than another student who may not have those same experiences. So we're gonna keep these in mind when we think about some supports to put in place. The overall concepts that are going to guide these supports kind of fall in some categories. But before we talk about those, I want you to briefly watch this clip and see if you feel like this has been an effective learning experience.
You're doing great. We're gonna try this again, okay?
Okay.
Wheels, pedals, handlebar, brakes. Sit up straight, keep your weight in the center, keep your eyes on the road, hands on the grips, butt in the seat. If we feel ourselves falling, what do?
Just keep pedaling.
Good girl. Now remember, it's all about balance and steering. Steer with your hands, steer with your body. Steering to the corners and you stay out of trouble. And the bell's your buddy, so go ahead and ding that. All right, you ready? Here we go. Pedal, honey, pedal. There you go, you're a bike rider.
Okay, so was that successful? Raise your hand if you feel like that was successful. Did it go well? No. Why not? It was a lot. I don't know what he was talking about. Fast, it was all at one time. It was not experiential. It was just do it and go. Now, I hope, and I would assume none of you instruct your class in this way, but we are a very verbal culture. If somebody doesn't do something that we say or doesn't seem to understand it, what do we tend to do? Repeat it. Say it louder. Say it in add more detail to it. Get closer. Okay, think about, have any of you ever been to a country where you didn't speak their primary language that was there? I have too. I thought I did. I took 4 years of French, but when I went to Paris, I realized I did not actually know French. I could read some signs, but that was it. You could repeat it in French as many times as you wanted. You could re-explain it in French. You could say it as loud as you wanted. That wasn't gonna help me. All it made me want to do was either slap the person or go do what I did do one night, which was just get some bread and cheese and go back to my hotel and eat it because I didn't want to keep trying to order food and ask people things. So again, the communication level is gonna vary across your students. And some students who are nonverbal do also have very delayed receptive communication, and others are going to have very good receptive. But regardless, that experience of the barrage of verbal information is very, very hard for individuals with autism. So what we just saw and what you maybe experienced in other countries can be what that experience feels like with how we approach those situations. So I want you to keep that in mind when you are approaching a situation with a student with autism, and think about, if something's abstract, what components of it can I make concrete? And I'm going to talk about some ways to do that. If there's something that's unspoken or assumed in this situation, how can I make it explicit? I don't want there to be the assumption, or as much as I can. If I'm presenting things verbally only, how can I also make it visual? Model it, gesture it, use a picture, which again is good teaching to have manipulation tasks, but even more so just in general interactions. How can I use the least amount of words to get my point across? We talk sometimes, we call it telegram speech, although I feel like now it should be like Twitter speech or something, of this idea that if you had to pay for every word that came out of your mouth, what are the most important ones? I know I would be spending a lot of money by the end of every day. And we just add so much filler that's not necessary and can be really confusing. If the environment is unstructured or overwhelming, or there's pieces that seem like they may be, how can I add some structure and predictability to help at least make that piece not quite as much a part of what's going on? So with these are the concepts that most of the evidence-based practices for supporting students with autism are based in. That's the first thing you want to think about. Keep these concepts in mind and then seek practices that support that have evidence. We know the importance of that, the importance of using things that we know have research behind them. When it comes to the world of autism and interventions, there are lots out there that we can spend a lot of time talking about. These are two different documents that are review documents. One of them is the National Autism Center's National Standards Project, and the other is the National Professional Development Center's Evidence-Based Practice Report. They were both published a couple years back and reviewed the literature up until that point and placed them into categories based on what was available and the quality of research, the amount of research, the focus of the goals, the outcomes, that kind of thing. These are really great references. They're both free. There's teacher and parent versions of this one. And it can be a great way to communicate in an IEP meeting when a parent's trying to understand why you are or aren't doing certain things, with an administrator if you're trying to understand why you may need more support for a certain thing, and just for your own use. If you Google these, they're available free PDFs. Also, if you want handout versions of my PowerPoint, I'll give you my email at the end. But this can be a great place to start with that. And those kind of define what is evidence-based, what's established, and then what are emerging. You know, there are some things that aren't yet considered established, but have promise, and with more research, hopefully will become established. Then there are others that are unestablished and actually proven to be ineffective. So that's going to be important to know first. But there are a lot in these first categories, so we don't want you just to pick like it's a menu. Which name do you like? Which one is your go-to? The other piece of what's considered evidence-based is just as equally weighing these things after you start with this. What is my judgment of what is best in this setting or with this student or students with a similar profile? What are the values and preferences of that student, of their family, of my class, of this school, of this district? And then what do I have the capacity to actually do in the way that the research intended it? Some of them require a lot of training and a lot of resources and a lot of feedback, and you may not have that. So to try to do it without that isn't really the intervention that was researched anyways. It would be better to do some of the ones that require less, that you're able to do well, and recognize that. So that's where you want to start when you're looking at intervention strategies that are out there that you can incorporate in your class. And then you want to think about learning as a behavior. And what I mean by that is we know behavior is what we do in response to things in our environment. But oftentimes when we say behavior, we just mean this over here, this type of thing, which that is a behavior, but so is talking at lunch, so is completing my math assignment. It's what we do in life. And learning is simply a change in behavior as the result of experience. And we all know natural learning experiences are very important. And learning is beyond report card grades and test scores and things we can measure in those ways. For individuals with autism, this is going to be so important because, as I just talked about, the base of their diagnosis isn't in those things. It's in these other pieces that can impact their involvement, but our goals need to be aligned with that. Our goals are going to be focused on those kind of work-related behaviors that are going to help them show us their skills. So the sitting, the waiting, the taking turns, the understanding classroom rules and expectations, those types, organizing yourself, those kind of things are going to be where we're going to see more success and more need. And oftentimes we miss in those students that may present with higher skills because it's not as obvious to us. Or we miss with kids who have really low skill level because we don't think they're capable of those things, which I already covered. We don't want to think that way. There may not be some of the same skills that we might see with another student, but we don't want to assume they're unable to be a part of certain situations because of some of the behaviors that I just talked about. So the way we're going to do that these evidence-based practices are focused in, is what's called applied behavior analysis, or ABA. There's a toolkit up here that briefly defines it because there's a lot of misconceptions about what that is. I'm not going to go into all of it today because I don't have all day, but it's a science that studies behavior and looks at how to help teach in effective ways. There's a lot of different strategies that fall under that umbrella. A lot of supports and things you probably do in your classroom that fall under this and you didn't even realize it. But all of them use this learning as behavior idea to look at behavior from a skill-based way. So the type of goals I just talked about, teaching new skills, increasing what they already know, supporting that generalization and maintenance that we know is really hard for students with autism, like I already mentioned. If I learned this here with you, does that still apply in the hallway? The red card, is that the same as the red stop sign? Some of those pieces. And that's going to increase these functional skills that will allow them to succeed in their environment, and in turn will decrease those challenging behaviors. This is important in thinking about the examples I'm about to give you, because a lot of times we try to start right here. And we can't start right there, and we can see some progress, but it's not going to be as successful long-term if we take a skill-based approach to those challenges you're seeing with a student with autism. So giving an example of what I mean by that, I mentioned the waiting. So let's say you have a student who has a hard time when he finishes a task while his peers are not done. He has a hard time sitting and waiting and occupying himself. Has anyone ever had that or something similar maybe in their class? So maybe he runs around the class, or he goes and bothers his friend, or he tries to leave the class. So I could start with, I'm going to teach him not to run around the class. Now, if I start with that, a couple of things. If I'm understanding things literally and you say don't run around the class, that leaves doing cartwheels around the class, crawling around the class, singing. You just said don't run. And we already talked about that literal understanding. But the other piece is, if I'm telling you what not to do, what do I assume you know? What to do? And we can't assume that with a lot of kids, but based on everything I've already talked about, we can't assume that a student with autism has picked up on the to do. The good news is with every don't, there is a do. So with the example I just gave, instead of focusing on the don't, I'm going to focus on teaching that skill of waiting and sitting and occupying myself when my friends are busy. So maybe the new skill is how to occupy myself. We know play and leisure skills are hard for students with autism often. So maybe that's going to be my first focus, letting them know what's available, teaching independent play and leisure activities. And then they know how to sit and wait, but maybe not the length that they need in that situation. So I'm going to increase that. Then I'm going to purposely focus on generalization by having them do the same thing in the cafeteria, or tell mom to do the same things at the doctor's office. That's going to increase a very functional skill while decreasing the running, the crawling, the screaming, the running out of the room. And this is going to be much more meaningful for that student and successful. So I really want, that's that second take home, is focus on what to teach them to do instead of what not to do. When a student doesn't know how to read, we don't punish them for not knowing how to read. We teach them how to read. If a student doesn't know how to navigate a social situation, we need to look at it in that same way. So the way we're going to do this is applying what's called the ABC model of behavior that I'm sure many of you have seen or used as a part of a lot of ABA interventions. And it's that idea of looking at these behaviors that we want to see more of and we want to see less of, really defining them in a way where we can start to tune our eye to what happened right before and what happened right after. Because we can get really overwhelmed with all the other stuff that we have no control over or that we aren't clear about. But the way that time works, there's always something that happens right before and right after a behavior, always. So if we can tune our eye to that and see trends in that, we can start to understand what can I do on the front end to set situations up for success? And how can I respond in a way to make this a learning opportunity that helps them to see the next time this situation comes up, this is what I should do. Or the next time it comes up, what I did last time didn't really serve any purpose. It didn't get any need met, so there must be something different I'm supposed to do. And the repetition of experiencing that as a student is where the learning's gonna occur. Again, for anyone, but especially from students with autism who are going to need to experience that repetition and understand that in order for learning to occur. So just so we can think about how to tune our eye, we're gonna use Full House, which is where I've learned most of my life lessons. So we're gonna do that here too, to look at just a little interaction with Uncle Jesse and see what the ABC was.
Uncle Jesse doesn't know any bedtime stories.
Yes, he does.
No, he doesn't.
Yes, he does.
No, he doesn't.
Yes, he does.
I'll make one up. Why?
So what was the behavior we saw there? Stephanie was crying. What happened right before it? Yeah, he's like, I don't know any stories. She cries. What happened? He's like, okay, I'll make one up. Okay, just stop crying. So kind of getting at what you were talking about. And again, we're not getting into the details of that today, but just to think about the trends. Next time Uncle Jesse tells me I don't know any bedtime stories, if I'm Stephanie, what am I gonna probably try to do? Pretend to cry, because I learned in this A, if I do this, something I perceive as good happens. If nothing really good happened, or he told me to ask nicely, or he prompted some other behavior, then the next time, I'm not gonna waste my time crying. I'm gonna jump to whatever thing was appropriate and what taught me. And that's what we wanna think about with the ABCs. So the big piece is we wanna set it up for success. We want to not just prevent so we can avoid challenges, but to help our students, any student, but our students with autism experience success and see what comes of it, rather than waiting and doing damage control after the fact. Because as we've seen, that's not typically the most helpful thing. So when we're thinking about setting it up for success, given everything I've talked about, the 3 things we want to keep in mind, I talked about on there, abstract to concrete, some of those things to consider. If we're able to clarify the expectations and establish predictability and reduce distractions, given everything I've talked about, that is going to go a very, very long way in self-contained class, in inclusion, in gym, on field trips, in an EC classroom, in a high school classroom. When I was talking about going into classrooms, this is where I start with every class and every teacher. Are these things being addressed? And if they aren't, let's stop and think about all of what I just talked about and figure out how to make these things improve first and foremost before anything else that we do. And many times, focusing on this takes care of a lot of the other things that are later on our list because it settings the situation up for success. So I'm gonna very briefly highlight some of the types of things that tend to support these goals. First is environmental arrangement. And this refers to the way we organize the classroom, but not because I like a certain theme or because I like things organized a certain way or because I think it's pretty, which are sometimes our guiding things when we're setting up our classrooms, which is fine. They're great. You're in that every day. Make it somewhere you like. But we're talking about this in this situation as using the environment as a learning tool, using it to teach the things I was just talking about that students with autism may not always pick up on. So I know this example is hard to see. This is an early childhood classroom that we went into and we helped them rearrange, and it's hard to see, but she had a lot of great things in place, but there was a lot that made it hard when you walked in to understand those expectations. A lot of things that could be distractible, a lot of things that were unpredictable. So we were able to change things in a way where your goal is kind of, if someone walked into my class and I wasn't here and nobody was here, would they be able to figure out based on how the class is set up, what's expected in the different parts of the room? And would be able to do those things based on how that part of the room is set up. So some things to consider in your classes, and I know it varies depending on the setting you're in, but these are things to kind of stop and ask yourself. First, think about how you're using your walls. So again, and I've been guilty of this too, so it's not a criticism, but sometimes we get really excited about putting stuff on our walls and we go in and it's like wallpapered with like 5 different alphabets and 4 inspirational posters. And then we've got the stuff we have to have up, like the fire drill stuff and the cafeteria stuff. And then there's sprinkled in there some things that our students are supposed to reference, like who cleans the tables in the lunchroom that day. And it's a lot to look at. And a lot of those things, maybe things you're not even necessarily referencing functionally, because maybe they're way up here and that's not where my students even are. So first stop and assess your walls and think about What can I take down that I don't really reference and that's maybe getting in the way of the things I do try to reference and want my students to see? If I have things like art, like in this picture, that's great. We want to show things our students have done, but let's be purposeful with it. Let's have it in a certain area that's maybe up higher. And the things students are supposed to reference are more at their eye level and separate from adult stuff. Maybe the adult things that have to be posted are higher and in a different area, so that what is there that's intended to be used is functional and decreases that distraction. Yeah. If it's there for a purpose, then yes. If you're going to use it as a teaching tool, then yes. But if it's amidst a lot of other things that are just kind of there because I thought maybe we'd reference them at some point, or I think they're pretty, or we used them in one lesson a long time ago, then it kind of takes away from the stuff that has a purpose to be there. And if it needs to be there, I'm definitely not proposing that you go in and just clean off your walls. Use it purposefully. Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. And that's kind of like what I said here. So something like that, just make sure that that's not like within eye level of where I'm expecting them to do their independent work and they're going to sit and stare at that the whole time. Or it's right up beside the schedule they're supposed to reference to know when they go to speech, and it's going to be cluttered in that. Make it purposeful and in a place where you're displaying it, but it's not taking away from the other things they're needing to do. And then that goes along with this next piece of kind of the adult-directed and child-directed stuff. So there are things that aren't for them to need to reference. This is thinking back to those unspoken rules. We want to teach by the way it's set up. This is available, this isn't. This is for me, this is for you. I'm a huge fan of curtains and tablecloths and things like that, just fabric, because it makes that abstract concrete. So this is stuff I'm allowed to pull and use. This is stuff just the teacher uses, so I'm not supposed to. It's a simple way to not have to continue to repeat that and to understand that concept that there are sometimes things that are not an option, and I can understand that. I'm not gonna have to cover every single thing that's ever not an option, but I'm teaching that concept. And then maybe if it's something like this, that these are materials that are sometimes used and sometimes not, when they're available and for use, the sheet's up. When they're not, it's down. It answers, again, that idea, that subtly changeable rule. I'm still in the same classroom and I was able to play with that stuff 20 minutes ago. Why is it not an option right now? I can see visually and in a concrete way. When that's down, it's not an option. When it's up, it is. That also decreases that distraction of when I'm running by, maybe I'm going to stop and play, or when I'm upset, I'm going to swipe it off. It decreases some of those things. So limit accessibility, and then visually define some expectations. Just like sheets and tablecloths are my friends, tape is big time my friend when I go in classrooms. So like in this abstract idea of keep your materials to yourself. What does yourself mean? So maybe I'm gonna do this on my table in small group instruction. All your stuff stays right here. Teacher stuff stays back here. So that's not for your hands. Now, again, this isn't meaning you're going to have to do that everywhere they ever go, but you're teaching this abstract concept in a concrete way that they can then understand and reference down the road. I was in a classroom, a resource classroom, just a few months ago, and one of the teachers was talking about, she had come to one of our workshops and she had done this and it was really helpful, and then they had to peel the tape off for something. And before she had time to go back and get it, all of her students were now following that rule because they had that reference that they could think to now that they didn't have before. Same with something like keep your hands and feet to yourself, personal space, like I already mentioned. Or how many of you have tried to make this concrete, like stay in your chair or keep your bottom on your chair and then the chair goes all the way across the room? Or I've got one little bit of my leg still on the chair, so I'm technically following it. Okay, this is a little easier. You and all of you and your chair needs to stay in this taped area. That's what this means. And then maybe I don't have to always do that. Strategically arrange areas of the room based on what will be in line of vision. Again, to communicate those expectations. So maybe if a student is doing independent work or individual work and gets very distracted, moving things like room dividers or furniture or something to clarify that can decrease the distraction, but can also clarify that expectation. I know with a lot of teachers I work with, they'll say when there's something they're supposed to do independently, they don't realize that. So they're constantly looking maybe for their paraeducator to help or somebody else. This can be a way to communicate. When you're over here, you're just doing it. And when you're done, you can come tell me, rather than avoiding that confusion. Or maybe in the large group classroom, maybe you're not able to do it that way. And when it's individual work, you just have them put folders up like you do for testing sometimes to help clarify that expectation. Maybe you use different cues. When it's interactive small group, maybe I put this stuff out for them to understand we're working together right now. If you've got to use a space that has a lot of different purposes, switch out the materials in a way to make it clear by the materials what the expectation is and establish that expectation in that way. And then providing organizational structure. This was a teacher at a high school that I loved. Her student was forgetting things often when he would get to her class, and she helped him color code in his locker. Anything that went to literature was blue. So I just got to grab it, I look, I see where I'm going. And having that organization kind of imposed on him in a visual way helped him start to understand how to prepare for class and do something in a more independent, abstract nature. And then just same kind of thing in a classroom. Color coding of things, organizational structure. We know those executive functioning skills are often harder for individuals with autism. But what we've seen is often once that structure is there, then they can become more independent in imposing it on themselves. We have a administrative assistant who has an autism spectrum disorder, and we've experienced that with him, that initially we had to provide some structure around tasks that now he saw that structure help me complete them. So now I impose that structure myself when I'm completing those tasks. So that's the first piece, environmental arrangement. Some other ways to do it are some other visual supports. So schedules. We all have schedules because we have a schedule at our school. So again, not necessarily just meaning what's the schedule of your day, but thinking more about using it as a learning tool. How many of you have planners that you use on your phone, or maybe you still have written ones? I really, really rely on that. And even if I know what's happening in the day, I need to check it again. And I need to use it to look forward towards things I got to prepare for. That's what we're talking about with that predictability piece that I mentioned earlier. This can be one of the biggest things to help with challenges with transitions because it provides that structure. So it can take many forms, as I'm sure you've seen and used in your classes, but you want it to include the activities and time ranges accurately. If you don't know that, then don't put the time range so then don't put it. Because if I'm understanding things in a rule-governed way and then that changes, I don't know what that means. Does that mean everything's off today? Does that mean it's always going to take longer? So then don't put it. Not so that you're keeping it from them, but so that you can communicate that in a different way off the schedule that's actually accurate. I've been in a lot of classrooms that, again, I'm not faulting anyone because it's usually out of your control, where this looks nothing like what the actual day consists of. Then it's not a tool. It's just another pretty picture on the wall. And if I'm trying to refer to it as a tool, as a student with autism, that's going to make me that much more anxious. So make it accurate. Post it where students can see it and model how to use it and refer to it frequently. Don't just let it be wallpaper. Go through, we're done with morning work, now it's time for interventions. We're done with interventions, now it's time for science. And with that, teach flexibility. Include a symbol or a word that represents when the schedule will change, like the field trips, like it rained today so we can't go outside, like there's a fire drill after lunch. We can't always control those things. Sometimes we don't know until 5 minutes before. But part of why this is helpful is sometimes teachers and parents I work with are concerned that doing this will actually cause more rigidity because it's like, well, then what if it changes? We actually know from the research and from experience, it does the opposite. It teaches flexibility. And here's some reasons why. Oftentimes, like I said at the beginning, students with autism are rigid because they're not able to read the cues as to know when something's going to change and what that means. So I need to impose that on myself because I'm really anxious about that. So if somebody's able to show me there is some method to this madness, and yes, things do change, but we're going to let you know, and it doesn't mean everything's changing. If I'm a student with autism and we suddenly have a field trip at the end of the day, does that mean the rest of the week is off? Does that mean I'm not ever, what does that mean for me if I'm not reading those assumed expectations of a field trip? If I'm able to see, we're going to the gym today instead of outside because it's raining, but look, everything else is just the same after it. I can understand and prepare myself and actually have much less anxiety around it. And when you're teaching that, you want to teach that sometimes oops are good. Sometimes it's oops, we get to stay in the gym longer today because there's testing going on or whatever. Oops, we got to have an ice cream party today. Change isn't always bad. And so if I communicate it, I can prepare myself for that. If we just try to let's just not mention it because he's going to get really upset about it, that's going to perpetuate the next time that happens. This is not something that I like. I mean, so many of our kids that are getting pulled in and out for different things, I can't keep track of where they're going to be. And it's Monday's completely different than Tuesday's completely different than Wednesday. So that brings up the individual schedule. So we want to have that daily. For some students, that's the level of support they need. How many of you, if you are at something and there's a schedule up there, that you write it down so that you can check the stuff off, maybe? Sometimes I know I've done that. Like a graduation, for example, I'm following the names. I'm okay, we're at the L's, we're halfway through because it's long. So sometimes kids are gonna need more support and have an individual schedule that they need because there may be variability in their specific schedule, or they just may need that support. So I want you to kind of go through, like I said, those 3 goals. Think about the arrangement. That's gonna be the foundation, the environment. And then how can I communicate in a predictable way? And then do they need more individual support through an individual schedule? You can tailor it based on the needs of that student and how concrete they need it. The most concrete level is an object schedule. So this spoon was actually what was brought to breakfast. This diaper was what they used, so that it was very concrete if they couldn't understand that representation. Or it could be line drawings like this that stand for something that they may not understand at first, but the more you pair it together, they do. Or it could be, this is similar to what you just talked about, in a little folder, and they're able to independently move it over, and maybe there's photos of actual things, and maybe some of it's line drawings. Maybe it's words, but it's still something to help them manipulate it to pay attention. Or maybe it's just written out on a dry erase. Visual supports make a huge difference, and it's kind of like what I just said before about couldn't find the words, but I can point to a picture. I can't express the abstract idea of being frustrated, but I know that that picture stands for that, and if I point to that, somebody helps me or lets me take a break to deal with it, yeah. So with these individual schedules, you want to also think about how to make it a useful tool. It's not going to be something that's just stuck in their folder and nobody really ever references. None of these are going to work if they're just there and magically making a difference. So you want to try to balance preferred and non-preferred. So this may be where maybe you arbitrarily put something for 5 minutes between certain activities. Because if I'm looking and I see thing I hate, thing I hate, thing I hate, thing I hate, I'm probably not going to be super compliant with it. But if I see, okay, math is really hard for me, but then we go to the computer lab after, which I really like, and maybe you can't alter the schedule to that degree, but if they know I get 5 minutes to play with this toy between these 2 things, or I get whatever it is, I can get through this because I see something else is coming. Or I don't like transitioning away from computer time, but I see that I get it again at the end of the day, so I can deal with that. And referencing it before and after and having them manipulate it, it's an active tool to track movement, to track that progress and prepare myself for what's going to happen next and for those changes. So we talked about schedules. Next, task analysis. That's like a schedule, but this is sort of more, instead of your planner, how many of you have to-do lists or grocery lists? Talk about, I would just wander the grocery store for hours if I didn't, even if I think I know what it is. I need to reference it. It needs to keep me on track. That's what this is. So the schedule is going to be kind of letting them know what's happening in the day. The next level, I've arranged the environment. I've let them know what's happening in the day. Now let me think about the times of the day where it needs to be broken down further. And the types of tasks this tends to be useful for are tasks that have multiple steps. So like lunch. Lunch is not just going and eating lunch. There's a lot of things that are expected. So multiple steps, having it written down in a way that I can bring with me and keep track can be really, really important. Tasks that are particularly long. So recess. There's not a lot of structure there. For individuals with autism, long times with no structure is incredibly overwhelming oftentimes. So maybe I need to provide arbitrary structure just to help them be successful. This is the order of things you do so that I've got some guidance that I can be independent with these things and interact socially. Or maybe if you've worked with students who at recess play with mulch in the corner or wander the perimeter. Everybody needs time to decompress. So if that's what they need for decompression, that's fine. But I want to make sure that sometimes that's because they don't know what else to do or know what their options are. So I'm going to teach these things. You do these things first, then you can go take a break, do whatever the last half. But I'm providing some structure. Tasks that are repeated frequently. Maybe guided reading is every single day, and there's certain things they're supposed to do. I'm just going to have this on their desk, and they check off as it goes, instead of me constantly having to repeat all of those things and remind of those different pieces. Things that require lots of prompts, like I just said. This was in a classroom where different students did these things different days, wiping tables, sharpening pencils, sweeping the floor. So they would often forget what it involved when it was their turn again. So if it was their turn, they just took this out of the little holder and had that with them to know what that involved. So it didn't require reinventing the wheel every single time we did this. And things you're expecting them to do independently. Hand washing, blowing your nose, going to the bathroom, things like that. We want our students to learn how to do independently. So having this can be a great way to fade out your role. A lot of students we work with become prompt dependent because they've had wonderful adults that have really helped talk them through everything. So now they expect that at each step, or they wait for that at each step. Verbal prompts are the hardest to fade out because I'm waiting to hear, even if I know what the next thing is. This can be a great way to start to refer to that. This is where the answers are instead of me. And I'm going to turn my voice off. I'm not going to talk so much. I'm going to see that I'm not the source of information for this. That is. And I'm going to fade myself out. So this can be another really, really helpful piece for that. Making it concrete, making it visual, clarifying those expectations. Then other visual cues that there's a million we could spend a lot of time thinking of. But just after you've done those things, is the environment set up for learning? Have I displayed and explained what's going to happen throughout the day? Have I broken down tasks that tend to need the support like I just mentioned? Now, what are other areas of the day where I'm expecting my students to follow unspoken or abstract rules in order to be successful? And what can I do to make them more concrete? So academically, behaviorally, or socially. So timers, I don't know how many of you use timers. I know I mentioned before that none of these things are magic. Sometimes timers are magic. It's incredible to me. It still amazes me how quickly I'm like, oh, well, okay, that's all we needed was a timer. Because it plays on a lot of those strengths. It's that visual, concrete, rule-governed behavior of, it's not me saying time's up, that thing just dinged. We gotta follow it, so let's go. Because that concept of wait and later and almost and soon is very, very hard to comprehend a lot of times and varies a lot. How many of you have said wait when you really meant no? Because you didn't want to say no in the moment. You're like, maybe later, we'll see, maybe. And then that time means nothing anymore. How many of you had said 5 more minutes and you're like, shoot, this task took way longer than I thought. Okay, just 10 more minutes is what I meant. And we keep going. This keeps you honest. It makes it an IOU. It makes it concrete so that the student can understand on both sides, okay, this task is really hard, but we're almost done. Or I'm gonna have to stop playing computer soon, so I've got to prepare myself for it. It works on both ends, but can be a really helpful tool. Behaviorally, so you mentioned this at the beginning about how do you make those abstract concepts concrete that aren't actually concrete. A way to do it is find components that are concrete to start with in teaching that abstract idea. So a lot of schools have the rule that be safe, be responsible, be respectful, whatever maybe your rules are for your school. Those are super abstract concepts. Being respectful at home may be very different than school. Being respectful in kindergarten may be really different than first grade. So I need to communicate that in a concrete way. In this class, what does respectful mean? In the do's, it means these things. What does being safe mean? It means these things. These are ways that I can make it concrete and visual and can provide that feedback. I love how you held hands in the hall. That's being safe. Thank you for waiting your turn. That's being respectful. I can then use those to learn more abstract concepts. There's obviously a lot of other things that go with being safe and respectful, but it gives a concrete visual base to understand that abstract concept. So that's how I would say to do that. It could be just basic things of this is how I pay attention in gen ed. Maybe I get pulled into a certain class and it's really hard. So I'm just gonna have this on that student's desk of this is what they expect during the large instruction when you're in there. That's what participating in that classroom means. Or maybe I use these to give that feedback. So many of our students only hear about these things when they're not doing them. So they might not know what it looks like I said. So using this, if that's a quiet mouth, I love how that was quiet. That's being respectful. And then maybe when I'm not using it, I can just point to that as a reminder instead of stopping everything and shifting my attention to this behavior. So making it concrete where you can and referencing that abstract. And then same with social. There are a lot of decision trees we use in life that aren't laid out for us that we can make more concrete, like this. Greetings, what's the difference if it's someone I know versus someone I don't know? And not that you've got to draw this out for every social situation, but again, it gives method to the madness. Understanding there are things I do. I've used it, there's some stuff out there, Michelle Garcia Winter's work around being a social detective of let's check. When I worked with a social skills group for college-age individuals with autism. And one of the things we focused on was look at eyes, mouth, and hands to see how they're responding to what you're talking about right now. So giving some concrete examples of these abstract concepts can be a really, really important component. Okay, so some of the mistakes with those things. A lot of them, if you do what I just said, it'll take care of those mistakes. But things that I tend to see when I go in classrooms that have just been kind of overlooked or drifted over time are the absence of clear boundaries. So really open spaces where it's not clear that this activity begins and this activity ends. It leaves a great racetrack if I want to run across the classroom, and it doesn't make it clear. So how can I use furniture, tape, different things to make the boundaries clear to teach that rule? Expectations are different over here than they are over here. Appropriate structure of things like the items are distractors. So like I mentioned before, the artwork is right there where they're supposed to be doing independent work, or everything's all in one space together, or there's too much of that. Maybe if we have a classroom where you don't have a choice, put a sheet over it. Things like that to try to decrease that impact. Being aware of how you use different areas, knowing what we mentioned about the sensory sensitivities, quiet spaces being too close to loud spaces, or individual work being at a table where there's a whole bunch of other stuff there or other people are nearby. Try to be aware as much as you can of that piece. And then the visual supports that have been made, like the kind I just showed, that are beautiful and took you a ton of time to make, are stuffed away in a cabinet and aren't ever used, or the schedule's hanging up and we haven't looked at it since August and it's February. Make these tools. They're not magic just by being in your room. They need to be purposefully referenced and easy to access. The example you gave about the emotions, if that was up in a cabinet somewhere and I've got to ask somebody for it and go get it and climb up and get it, I'm probably just going to flop to the ground to let you know that I'm angry. But if that's taped on my desk, I can just point to it and take a break. And then fading these things out too quickly or altogether. So some things I already mentioned aren't going to be there forever and aren't intended to be there forever. They're intended to create a framework and understand. But some things are going to be around in some way forever. Have any of you graduated yet from using to-do lists? If you have, let me know, because I want to know how you did it, because I need to. But it changed probably than maybe what your mom gave you a list of chores when you were little. Same way with things like visual schedules and task analyses. They may not need to as regularly reference them as they did at one point, but that doesn't mean they've graduated from the need to use those tools. In fact, research has shown that for vocational success, that's one of the main predictors of success is the ability to use and manipulate a schedule to regulate your day and regulate yourself. So it might not look like the little pictures. It may turn into line drawings, or it may turn into writing it out on a dry erase board. It may not be as detailed as it had to be when they were younger, but don't think that these are all things that they just need at the beginning and then they grow out of, because that's why the success is there. And that's part of adults, like the video we watched. She speaks to the need for still having those types of things more so than her peers, even being the age she is and with how successful she is in her life right now, because that helps get at that core deficit that we talked about at the very beginning. That helps set it up for success. And then in the last few minutes, thinking about the C. Now, I purposely didn't save a lot of time for this. There's a lot that can be said about it. But as this first point, like I said, when I go in classrooms, I'm gonna focus on the A a lot more and a lot longer to set things up for success. Because if we're never experiencing success, the C does not matter because we're never getting to behaviors that we want to try to reinforce. But after that, you do want to think about the C, like Uncle Jesse with Stephanie. We want to respond in a way that's going to teach if that wasn't necessarily what I was looking for or wasn't the right way to handle that situation, how can I prompt in a way that's going to show you this was the way to get that need met instead. This is what's expected in this situation. That didn't really serve any purpose, didn't really have any power, didn't have a function, but this does. And when you do this, what you were looking for actually happens. And then when that thing happens, I make sure to show that it has power and that it has meaning. So next time that A comes around, I'm gonna do that instead. That contrast is really, really important for our students to understand and experience. And that's where when you hear about function-based interventions, like functional behavior assessments and a lot of the evidence-based strategies that I mentioned, it's at the basis of that, which is again beyond today, but looking at why is this behavior occurring? What are they trying to communicate? And how can I find a replacement behavior that meets that same need, but is realistic for them, is easy for them, and is appropriate in this setting? And how can I teach that difference? Now, we all know what reinforcement is. We all know it's important, but just like some of these other things, everybody likes schedules, kids with autism really need them. Everybody likes reinforcement, kids with autism often need it in a more specific way. Now, I wanna watch this video and think about why this may be the case, and then we'll look at quickly how to use it, and then we'll be done. Did the people seem as though they knew how to walk on stairs instead of an escalator? It seemed like it. Did they know that the stairs were an option? Yeah. What changed it for them? Yes, it was worth the effort, the extra effort, because of what I got out of it. That's reinforcement in a nutshell. There's fancy definitions, but it's basically what are you willing to work for? I love chocolate, and there's certain things I would do for chocolate. I might run and get something from your car for you, whatever. I'm not gonna go to work for chocolate though. I love my job, but I've gotta pay my bills. That's not worth my effort, no matter how much chocolate you give me. That's the difference in liking something and something being reinforcing. And that's what was going on here. And the reason I asked those questions is how many times have we accidentally done I know they know how to do it, I've seen them do it before. Okay, but maybe that thing takes a lot more effort for them because of everything we've talked about. It may be overwhelming. It may be anxiety provoking. It may be unclear. And some of those social reasons that I might do that because all my friends are doing it may not be things that are going to be as much on their radar as motivating to them. But if we can put something in place to show, I get that that's harder, and I acknowledge that. So if you do it, there's something that's meaningful to you, and I can experience it and learn it's not as bad, it's not as scary, it's not as hard, and I associate it with something I really like, that's going to be a big, big difference. And sometimes there's that, I shouldn't be rewarding them for something they should do. Okay, but would you just go to work because that's the good thing to do? Probably not forever. And in order to experience that success, maybe eventually you want them to do that thing because that is the respectful thing to do. But I've got to experience it first and see that it's not so hard and not so scary and learn from it. And maybe I won't always need, they may not always need the piano stairs. Now they're like, it wasn't that hard to go up the stairs. It's better for me anyways. I'll just do it. But maybe I needed that initially to get over that hump. And that's what we need to keep in mind with reinforcement. So very quickly, you want to think about how to creatively identify things that are reinforcing for your students. Again, not just something they like. Just because some of your students get really excited when you put a sticker on the board, if a sticker means nothing to me, and I don't care that my friend has 50, and I don't like the way it feels on my hand when you give it to me, no thank you, I'm just going to do this instead. This is where you can use those interests as an advantage. Help them understand. You can have access to these things that maybe you're not allowed to have all day long. Maybe sensory-based items, maybe topics. I worked with a boy who loved talking about Abraham Lincoln, and it was causing a lot of challenges because you want to talk about it everywhere. Instead of saying, nope, no Abraham Lincoln, because that's not fair. If somebody said to me, you really like massages, but you can't have them at work, so no massages anywhere, that's not okay. I need to learn I'm allowed to have those once a month when I schedule them on the weekend. Same thing with that topic. Once you do your work, you can talk to me uninterrupted about Abraham Lincoln for 5 minutes, and you can tell me whatever you want. And you can look at your Abraham Lincoln book, and that's fine. In this situation, it's not an option right now. So teaching where and when you can access those and pairing those with tasks that are hard can be really, really motivating. And then very clearly choosing that behavior, like I already talked about. Make it concrete, not just being good or being respectful. What do I need to do? And show it visually. These are a lot of different examples. They can be pretty, they can be on the fly. Even if you verbally say these things, we need that IOU. First, I do my work, then I get to go play with the microphone. And I do, what my work means is 6 tasks. So after each task, I check it off, I go take a break, then I come back and do 6 more, go take a break. Or first I wash my hands, then I get to that snack I really like. Maybe this is too abstract, so it's actual crayons. Once they're all full, it's for coloring. And maybe I get those every time I raise my hand instead of interrupting. The behavior is going to be based on what you're seeing that they need help with. What is the do you wish they were doing to get away from the don't that's causing a problem? And then make sure you actually honor it. Provide it immediately. Provide it based on the behavior and only on the behavior. If I have access to my iPad all day long and then suddenly you say, work for your iPad, no thanks, I'm good. I had it all day and I'm going to get it again in an hour, so I'll just wait for that. If this is the only way to get to it, it's going to be that much more powerful. And if I say you're getting it and then I'm like, oh, we ran out of time, we have lunch, you can't have it at the end of the day. If somebody told me that when it was time for my paycheck, I probably wouldn't work there for that long. So be honest with it. Make it immediate so that that connection is there, especially for our students who may be less verbal. They can make that connection with this happens right here. If I have it where I earn something at the end of the month, on Monday morning when I'm really tired, the fact that I'm going to earn that at the end of the month is not meaningful and motivating to me right now. It's got to be immediate a lot of times. And then you can fade to those more delayed things or have little things immediately and bigger things that they're working towards. And if they're earning the tokens working towards those delayed things, pair it with the praise. Let them know why they're getting it. You did such a good job waiting your turn. You got a check. Thank you for finishing that math sheet. Here's a token. So that they're learning through that of what the do's are in those situations. So just in closing, some kind of wrapping up. These are all things we've already talked about, but these things to really remember. First, use those characteristics that we talked about as an anchor for how you view and approach challenges with your student with ASD. Stay focused on that. Don't get lost in the other things that can be overwhelming and not accurate in how you're approaching it. But remember in doing that every student with ASD is different, so we're going to want to think about their individual goals and needs and interests. And then stop and think about what are the rules that are assumed and unspoken in situations. What about this environment may be contributing that I haven't even thought about? We've changed the lighting. New people are in here now. We've changed the seating arrangement. There's more stuff on the tables. What are some things like that that maybe I didn't even stop and think about? And then how can I focus on prevention instead of just reaction? Spending a lot of time on the A's to set it up for success instead of just the damage control after the fact. And how do I make sure to focus on what you want your student to do instead of just what we want them to stop doing? Just wanted to end for some motivational words from my favorite president, kid president. But if you make the world better for kids, you make it better for everybody. And so I appreciate what you all do, and hopefully doing these things will help make the world better for your students with autism and all the people they're able to touch in their life. Like I mentioned quickly, there's some stuff